In today's class, we're going to briefly review aggregate demand, talk about what the short-run aggregate supply curve or aggregate supply curve looks like, and then talk about putting the two of them together. And you will do some practice problems on aggregate demand and aggregate supply for tomorrow. And then in class, we will go over those, and then you will take a quiz that will be similar problems to solve graphically. So first of all, to review, what determines the levels of consumption? That would be, consumption is a function of income. So income is the primary determinant, and of course other factors like wealth and taxes can impact consumption. The multiplier, think for a minute whether you remember what the formula is. The multiplier is 1 over the MPS, or 1 over 1 minus the MPC. That's the simple multiplier. And it explains how an increase in spending, such as investment, and we'll see government spending, can actually have a much bigger impact on GDP, because that $1 is spent repeatedly in the economy and each time ends up producing income for people. What determines levels of investment? That would be the interest rate. So rather than income, it's the interest rate that determines levels of investment. And investment is significant even though it's a small portion of GDP because it is so erratic. It changes great volatility from one period to the next. Business investors are much more quick to react to changes in the business cycle than consumers are. The shape of the aggregate demand curve looks like the shape of the simple demand curve in a simple market, but for different reasons, which we'll review in a moment. And the factors that can shift AD are anything that can change consumption, investment, government spending, or net exports. Those same factors we learned about that add up to GDP in Unit 2. So aggregate demand, again, it looks like demand for corn, demand for coffee, but there are very different reasons for that, because with simple demand, part of the reason it's downward sloped is diminishing marginal utility. But with aggregate demand, when you buy a car, that doesn't reduce how much enjoyment you'll get from a ski vacation, right? So you can't say that there's diminishing marginal utility. And also, if the price of all goods are going up, we can't really say, oh, you're going to substitute all other goods. So it's going to be a little bit different. And we talked about these yesterday. The real balances effect, the interest rate effect, and the foreign purchases effect. So when price levels go up, you are effectively able to buy less because your balances don't have as much value. Interest rate effect we'll come back to more later, but basically when price levels go up, you need to actually have more cash to be able to buy things that are interest rate dependent, and that causes interest rates to go up and then those purchases to go down. And the foreign purchases effect is a lot like the substitution effect. When our goods become more expensive, we tend to rely more on buying imports. So that's just a quick review of the aggregate demand curve. The shifters in aggregate demand, as I said, anything that will change C, I, G, or X. So if there's something that causes an increase in consumption, consumption is one of those aggregate demand shifters, we would see aggregate demand go to the right. If there's something that would cause a decrease in investment, like an increase in interest rates, we would see the entire aggregate demand curve shift to the left. So I think we're ready to look at aggregate supply. And aggregate supply in the macroeconomy, there are really two competing models for this. The one on the left is the Keynesian model, and the one on the right is the one that we're more often going to use. Sorry, my page numbers there, my little advanced thing is kind of getting in the way. So hopefully you can see that there are some similarities and differences between these two models. If you see at the bottom here, it says the one on the left, it points out has this Keynesian range, or this sticky range. And you'll notice that within that range of this aggregate supply curve, it's completely horizontal. Okay? And the one on the right doesn't have that. There is no sticky range. Also, the one on the left has a vertical range. Okay? And the one on the right in the short run doesn't have that, but you can see it is getting steeper and kind of moving toward that. And when we come back after break, we're going to add in another line on this graph called long run aggregate supply that will be a vertical line. So let's go back and look at this. Those are the differences. Let's look at what are the similarities. The similarity is this middle range here on the left-hand one is upward sloping, and it could be drawn as a straight line or it could be drawn like this. That's not really significant. And it looks very much like this one on the right. And what this is saying, and I'm going to focus on the one on the right now, is that aggregate supply, in other words, all producers in an economy, are going to increase their output when the price level goes up. Remember, the price level is like the price level indicated by the GDP price deflator or by the consumer price index. So if the price level is, say, 100, we're in a year when the price level is 100, we know that GDP is going to be, say, pretty close to this QF. But if the price level goes up to 110, output's actually going to increase, which seems kind of strange because that's really just inflation, right? So why would that happen? Well, there's a couple reasons. One of the reasons is that the producers don't realize individually, each of them, that it's not just increased demand for their good. So they see people spending more and they go, wow, people really want my basketballs, or people really want these new shoes I'm making, and they don't think to themselves, oh, it's just inflation. So when they see more demand for their goods, they actually start producing more goods. And everyone's doing this across the economy, so the GDP actually grows. So at higher price levels, producers are willing to produce more. Now notice that this, if you look at the one on the left, we have this vertical line. If you look on the right, it starts getting steeper and steeper. We reach a point where that doesn't really work anymore because we start to reach our capacity, right? So this increase only happens when we are actually below our capacity. So the graph on the left, the Keynesian graph, shows this really clearly, right? That there's a limit here. This is our long-run capacity. It's our potential GDP is another word for it. Or we could think of it in terms of the PPC, right? It's the most we're capable of making. And so additional increases in price level beyond that are only going to cause inflation. And we will see that happening in this model on the right when we introduce long run. But in the short run, okay, we're not going to see that. In the short run, we're just going to say, wow, as prices go up, producers continue to produce more and more output. And when prices drop, which signifies a drop in demand, producers are going to cut back, okay? Let me go back to the one on the left just for a minute again, to this sticky wages and prices range, this over here. What Keynes observed in the Depression was that demand had fallen off, okay? And if you think about these two together, right, that's the demand curve. When demand drops, right, we're going to have a reduction in output and some deflation going on, reduction in price level. That's what happened in the Depression. And what Keynes said is demand fell so low that we were down here and that wages and prices were sticky. They were resistant to further change. They wouldn't fall. But what's even more significant about this, and I'm going to erase just to kind of get rid of some of the messiness here, what's even more significant about this is that when you are in this range, if your aggregate demand is so low, you're way, look how far we are below the potential, right? We're so far below the potential that you could use government policy to stimulate demand and shift aggregate demand to the right without causing any inflation. Okay, we're going to talk more about this after break when we come back and look more at fiscal and monetary policies. Okay, but this is really critical, that Keynes believed you could use policy without causing inflation because, after all, you're so far below your capacity that there are no resource shortages. Now, if you look at the one on the right, what you'll notice is, and again, we're not really talking about capacity yet, but if you imagine that we have aggregate demand is right here, okay, we're producing this level of output, and something happens, right, that's going to increase our output. Okay, this model says, well, yep, output's going to increase, but you're also going to cause inflation. And that's going to have some long-run consequences. Right now we're in the short run. There's going to be some long-run consequences that are going to be problematic. Okay, and so while it seems like you can just increase aggregate demand, increase output, everything's great, that's really only going to be part of the story. So when you look at these two models, what they both have in common is that when the price level rises, aggregate demand tends to increase because each individual producer is making decisions based on demand for their good. And in their little happy world where people are buying more of their output, they're thinking, wow, I should produce more, right? But eventually, inflation's either going to catch up with them, or we're going to hit capacity for the economy. We're going to run out of resources. If everybody who's producing anything, they're all producing more, resources are going to become more and more scarce. And it's going to become very difficult to expand output. So we will analyze this model quite a bit more as we move forward. What I want you to think about for now is really just this short run consequence. So let's see. I already think I talked about this, right? That many production costs are sticky or fixed in the short run. Yep, and so producers are comparing higher or lower price levels to their costs. So they're making their decisions in isolation. Each one, as I said, doesn't see that inflation is happening. They think it's just their own happy little world. Oh, before we put them together, I guess we do need to discuss the shifters. So what could cause AS to shift? This is pretty easy, this list, because it's almost exactly the same list as what causes regular supply to shift, right? Very similar to our supply shifters from Unit 1. Resource prices, right? If oil gets more expensive or water gets more expensive or any other resource, steel gets more expensive, we're going to see aggregate supply shift to the left. If resource prices drop, we're going to see aggregate supply shift to the right. Productivity, right? Outputs over unit of input. If we get more productive, we're able to do more with less, right? Then supply is going to, again, increase, right? More productivity means more supply. If for some reason we let our capital depreciate, we lose it, we become less productive, our computers break down, we don't replace them, aggregate supply will shift to the left. And then last, this legal institutional environment. So do we have institutions that promote entrepreneurship? Do we protect people's property rights? Do we offer patents to new ideas? Those kinds of things are also going to shift aggregate supply to the right. Okay, so if we put these two together, then we can actually, and this again is just going to be short run, you'll notice that now I made this SRAS not a curve, just a straight line. It really doesn't matter. You can draw aggregate demand like this, and you can draw aggregate supply like that, or you can make them straight lines. But what we're going to be doing then is we're going to be looking at what is the impact on price level and GDP, and sorry, this really should be labeled PL, price level and GDP when various things happen in the economy. So, and this is again, just says Q1, okay, but down here it's labeled real GDP. So we're not going to worry for the purpose of this assignment or the quiz tomorrow, we're not going to worry about long run, we're not going to worry about capacity, we're just going to focus on the short run. So if we have something happen like a new discovery of oil, right, increases oil, reduces the price of oil, what's going to happen? Well, a change in the price of a resource is going to be a supply shifter. And since the oil got cheaper, that's going to actually increase the supply. So, sorry, I'm going to hide my y-axis a little bit there. So what's going to happen is SRAS will shift to the right. So you will draw it just like we did back in Unit 1 when we were doing simple supply and demand. Arrow, line, label. Okay, and you can see what happened. Price level dropped, right? Price level dropped, and output increased. So that's what you're going to be doing on this assignment, is looking at each of these items and saying, what is the impact on equilibrium price level and what is the impact on equilibrium output? So another example might be, what if, for example, interest rates increased? Well, if interest rates increase, as we learned, that will actually decrease investment. And investment is a component of aggregate demand. So interest rates increase, aggregate demand is going to shift to the left, right? What's going to happen? We're going to see a drop in price level, and we're going to see a drop in output. So for each one of these, you want to make sure that you have arrow, line, label, and that you also talk about what is the impact on price level and what is the impact on, sorry, I was going to say Q, which is a fine, or really what you're going to be talking about is what is the impact on GDP. So on the quiz, which you'll take tomorrow after we go over the practice problems, the way it will be set up is this. You will get 1 point for labeling all of the correct labels. So each graph has to have PL, price level, real GDP on the y-axis, not just GDP, but real GDP, short run aggregate supply, or it can just say AS. I won't mark it wrong if you put AS. It can be SRAS or AS, and then aggregate demand. Okay, and then you're going to have this problem. So everyone, you're going to set up the same way. You're going to be presented with a situation. You're going to get 1 point for drawing the correct shift. You need arrow, line, and label. Okay, arrow, line, and label. And then you will get 1 point for identifying the impact correctly, reading your graph. Okay, it is not possible to get a point, the last point, if you make the wrong shift. Okay, reading the wrong graph is not going to give you a point. So you actually have to have the correct shift in order to get the third point. But to get the third point, you have to identify the outcome in price level and real GDP. And as I said, we will go over these problems that are on the Moodle site in detail before you take the quiz on Wednesday. And that concludes the notes on aggregate supply. So you have time in class to work on the actual problems. And just to make sure that you can see that, the problems you're going to do are called manipulating the ADAS model. It's this sheet.